Welcome back to our course on blockchain and its applications. So, for the last few lectures we are talking about the different applications and use cases which are developed on top of blockchain. So, today we are going to discuss about another use case, that is the use of blockchain in public sectors or primarily for the government use cases. So, in the last lecture we have talked about how blockchain can be utilized in financial domain, particularly for the applications like cross border payment, and in this particular lecture we are also going to point out a few other applications which are much more prominent for the public sectors or the government policy management or the government information management. So, let us go through the details of that. So, this is the topic that we are going to cover today, the government use cases of blockchain, and these are the corresponding keywords. So, we are going to talk about public data management or how data management is done for the government databases, how that can be envisioned on top of a blockchain based architecture. Then the concept of public taxation like the GST, how blockchain can simplify the taxation procedure. And then we will talk about few of the national strategies that have been taken up by different government, particularly the government of India, and we will also consider the national strategy that have been taken up by the government of Australia as a use case study. And that way we will try to get a kind of good understanding of what are the applications or use cases of blockchain. So, if you just think about how blockchain is useful for different governmental applications. So, typically the government needs to maintain different types of data either in digital form or in traditional paper format. So, I think a couple of lectures back we have talked about one of such problem, that is the land registry management, and we have seen that there is a empty plenty of scope of utilizing this blockchain technology for land registry management, particularly the trading of lands and land like properties. And we have done a kind of critical review of that particular use case and tried to see what are the different challenges that we can face if we try to build up a blockchain based architecture like that. And we have just pointed out that what we should think about. So, we highlighted several open challenges or open problems in that aspect. Now, apart from the land registries or the land records, there are several other data that a typical government need to maintain, like the daily operations and activities of the government, the different kind of assets. Obviously, land record, as I mentioned, it is one of such asset. Then the building, the properties, the roads and so on. Then the details of its people, organizations, the different institutions, the records of people, the business transactions that are done by the government and so on. Well, so that way it is a kind of plenty of data that actually characterizes the current economy, the current status of a particular country. So, this government data is much more important from that perspective. Now, if you think about this governance architecture, means if you just think about take a case study of countries like India, you will see that by nature it is multi-institutional and multi-organization. So, in a democratic country like India, you have different states, and then different states have different districts, and under different districts you have the village, panchayat and cities and so on. And there is a kind of hierarchy of governance that comes from the central government to the lower level governance. Like we have the central government which has their own duties, own responsibilities, then every state has its own government, and under that state government there are the different districts, and every district also has the district level administration, and then comes the villages, the panchayat, the cities, they have their own governance to handle the day-to-day activities of their people and so on. Well, so that way we have a kind of clearly demarcated hierarchy of governance, and in this governance there is a requirement of strong coordination between individuals, because say for example, if you think about one particular use case that the money disbursement across different level of governments. So it is something like that the central government some part of their money they directly give to the state government, then the state government disburses to the district administration or the city panchayat level administration. Then sometime it happens that the central government directly send the money to the district administration. So there is a kind of complex flow of information, complex flow of assets and so on. Well, and as a consequence what we see that because it is a kind of a complex multi-institutional, multi-policy, multi-people architecture, we also have a lot of complaint about its day-to-day operations, the transparency in the process and so on. So, there is a lot of questions about that. There is no traceability or rather there is no information to the public that how the money is flowing from the top level government to the to its different hierarchies, right. So, there is always a claim that well the government money comes from the tax that is given by the public, and because the public is giving the money to the government in the form of tax. So, those money is accountable and the publics, the general common people, the citizens of a country have the right to understand, right to know that what is going to be the flow of the money and how that is being disbursed across different organizations, different institutes and so on. Well, so there are lots of debates around that. We do not want to go to that debate, but what we broadly understand that it is a kind of complex system. So, at some level if we can bring up transparency in the system, that is also good. I mean that is also good for the government perspective, that is good from the citizens perspective, and that is also good for the neighboring country and the kind of society perspective. So, that way we need to really carefully think of that how we can bring up transparency in this process, and inherently whenever I talk about the use cases of blockchain, one point that I have always mentioned or tried to convey you that blockchain is best suited when I do not have a single point of trust in the system, right. So, this complex hierarchical government is one of such example where again we do not have a single point of trust. So, say for example, there are multiple people who are collaboratively participating in this government's procedure. Now, if certain corruption happens at some level, it is very difficult to catch it because it is also encapsulated or hidden by the surrounding space. Well, so that way there is a clear demand that we need to bring transparency in the system so that such kind of corruption, such kind of misuse of the asset can be minimized. Well, so let us see that how we can utilize blockchain for this particular purpose. So, as I mentioned that the entire system is multi-institutional or multi-organization, and there is a kind of hierarchy of governance, and every level builds its own ledger or data. Well, and in every level you have different access management policies, you have role based access control on access management, you have different way of hiding the data, you have information that well this part of the data can be shareable and this part not. That way there is a kind of very complex hierarchy or complex policies that are being imposed on the entire end-to-end system. Well, and the data that is being flown or the assets that are being flown in this entire system, they have different priorities. So, there are certain information that is of highly sensitive, so that have the kind of high priority or highly secure data or assets. So, it has some kind of restricted access. So, for example, if you just think about a simple information like the Aadhaar data, we have also mentioned about this earlier. In the Aadhaar data, some part of the information, well, you can make it public, there is possibly no harm of it. Again, it is debatable. So, I am not going to that precise definition of privacy, that what is private, what someone should reveal to others and what someone should not. But one thing I clearly understand that well in my Aadhaar database there are certain information which is very much sensitive. For example, my address, my phone number, that kind of details which I bear, well as well as my biometrics. So, this kind of information is very much sensitive, and someone should not copy that information or someone should not steal that information. Well, so that way I need to ensure the privacy of the information at a required level, and at the same time I need to bring up transparency in the system. And as I mentioned that apparently there is no single point of trust on this kind of hierarchical system. So, if I just think of that how blockchain can help, well, so in this management of government data at different levels, so we can possibly think of different applications or use cases around it. There are also multiple different questions that I need to think of or I need to answer. So, for example, well, it is good that we are saying that we are going to put all this data or the asset information on blockchain so that it becomes transparent. So, for example, if you think of the money as an asset, what can possibly happen that whatever tax you are giving, that information is put up on a blockchain, and at the same time the way the money is getting disbursed at different level of governance, and from there different people, different contractor for building the road or property, something like that. So, that entire flow is recorded on a blockchain, and that way the entire thing become transparent, and that becomes good. But immediately the question comes, if you think of that, that is a kind of huge amount of transactions that happens at the government level. So, how we are going to maintain that data, or how we are going to store that data. So, there is concept like some part of the data is put up off chain, and you just put up the hash of the data or a part of the data, digest of the data on blockchain to ensure that integrity of the information, so that you can use the blockchain to track the information and accordingly keep the data in a second database in a kind of secured way. Well, so that way there are multiple different options that we need to explore, that whether we should put up the data directly on the blockchain, or we should have such kind of off chain data storage and then on chain data digest storage, that kind of architecture. So, an important question that I asked earlier, that who are going to be the participants. So, whenever I am talking about distributed ledger technology, so the distributed ledger means, or decentralized ledger means, every participant they need to keep a copy of that ledger with them. So, the question comes that who is going to maintain the copy of the ledger? Is it like the citizens of the country is going to maintain that copy of the ledger, or is it something that it is at some higher order where the citizens will have access? Well, so that way this core architecture, thinking about this core architecture is very much important. So, if you just browse over Google and try to find out, try to see the different use cases, you will see a lot of people, there are a lot of blogs, lot of websites, lot of technical documents, research papers and so on, which will tell you that, well, you either put up the data directly on the blockchain, or have the off chain data and put up the digest on the blockchain. But what they really cannot answer, or what they really do not answer, that who is going to maintain the node. Well, so I can apparently think of that, well, by using blockchain I can build up transparency, I do not need a single point of trust, all those advantages are there, there is no doubt in it. But from the implementation perspective, there is a big question that how I am going to maintain that decentralized ledger, who are the node of that ledger, who are going to keep that information with them. Well, because it is at the end of the day a kind of replicated system where everyone need to keep the entire copy of the ledger with them. So, who will going to keep that? Is it the citizen? Is it some special node, some special organizations, something like that? If it is some special organization, then who are those organizations who are going to keep a copy of that? So, that way I have different options that can be possibly explored for developing such kind of applications, and we still need a careful thought process on this system to understand that how I am going to interconnect the different people in a public domain with the help of a blockchain. Now, as I mentioned earlier that it is we understand that why the technology is required. So, there is no doubt on the motivation, and as I mentioned that government data is always a kind of major target for the hackers, and there are multiple different cases like that. So, for example, in 2020 there are around 1001 cases of data breaches that affected 155.8 billion individuals in USA. Well, so that is a source which is available from Statista. And then there is this concept of cyberware, so which is the kind of actions by a nation state to penetrate another nation's computers or network to extract their data, to extract their information out of it. And you will see that there are a lot of news which comes about the theft of government data, breaches of information from the government data. So, these are some of the information that or some of the newspaper article that I have just captured before recording this lecture today. So, it is most of these news are from October 2021, and you see that there are multiple such cases like this Argentinian government database containing ID card information of the entire country made available on dark web forum. Well, then info of 4.39 crore investors exposed twice within 10 days due to data breach at CDSL's KYC arm. Well, so that is the information leak from KYC. Then FBI warns of fake government sites that used to steal financial or the personal data. Also, that way you will see that there are lots of such incidents of data breaches which happen. So, the question comes that how I can prevent it, how I can store the data in a secured form, so that whenever I am sharing the data sharing architecture in such a way so that no one would be able to authorize or access my data in an unauthenticated way. Well, so that is the kind of core behind the problem. So, as I was mentioning that the major problem of government data is that the data is shared among multiple organizations at different level of government structure, and whenever the data is shared among multiple organizations, so this problem of data breaches come or data breaches increases at every level because of data duplication, data multiplicity for such kind of problems. Say for example, with your Aadhaar data. So, whenever you are submitting your Aadhaar data, you are submitting the KYC document on multiple places. So, that way the data gets duplicated or data get multiplied at multiple places, and that way it becomes very easy to steal those part of the data. Then that way whenever there is such kind of data duplication, data multiplicity happening, protection of data gets diluted if I have such kind of multiple copies of data exist, multiple copies of same data exist. Well, so from that particular aspect possibly blockchain can help. So, here is one example of sharing of passport data. So, passport data again it is considered to be a highly sensitive data. So, typically the Ministry of Foreign Affairs they have this passport data management system which ideally contains the passport data, but then whenever you are going to airport for say traveling to another country, so you are going through the custom check which contains your passport data, keep a copy of that. Then the National Army Defense Agency they sometimes ask for the citizen's passport to keep the data to differentiate a citizen from an imposter or from an unauthenticated person. Then the National Police Agency, CBI, CID, the crime department, they maintain, they sometimes take the passport data. So, for example, when your passport verification happens, that happens to this National Police Agency, such kind of environment. Then the Income Tax Department, National Intelligence, National Audit Agency, they does a kind of periodic change of the periodic check of the data to see that whether you have traveled, what happened at the customs, whether you have imported something and so on. Then this Ministry of Public Service, they also take this public passport data as a kind of your identity, your unique identity, to maintain it in their identity database to provide the public services. So, that way the data gets duplicated at different places and it increases the chance of data breaches from the environment. Well, so this is basically a typical government information sharing system. So, what we say that well the government data stores in a central directory like a data directory service or agency directory service, which has its own applications, the APIs for searching, retrieving data, and you have the service broker through which different organizations access the data. But the question comes that who is going to store the data with them. So, typically what happens that whenever certain organization or the civic service system or any kind of institutional organization they access the data from that central database, they also keep a copy of that with them. Well, so and whenever they are keeping that copy of we deemed that that actually increases the possibility of data breach from the system. So, the question comes that how blockchain help? Well, so as I mentioned earlier that you can have this access and verification of the central data, where typically the data is put in a central database, and this access to the database can be thought of the transactions. Now, every such transactions, that means access to the data is locked in a blockchain. Well, so the data can be accessed only via the blockchain. So, whenever you are or someone is accessing the data, the access is happening on top of blockchain. Now, that way anyone can verify who has accessed the data and for what purpose. Well, so that is the advantage that we get. Now, the question comes when sharing of data, right. So, you can either put the data in the blockchain. So, putting the data directly on the blockchain, as I mentioned earlier, that might not be the ideal solution at all the time. So, we need to think of alternate solution. But if you are putting the data directly on the blockchain, then it becomes transparent. So, everyone can verify which data has been shared, and that way the data cannot be altered, because you have the data at a blockchain based system. So, no one would be able to change that data and can share it somewhere else. Then you can also share the data and the access control, that means keep both the data and the access at the blockchain, but again it depends on the size of the data. In that case anyone can verify the data as well as the access of the data. So, it can verify that what is the data that is being shared and who has accessed that data for what purpose. That way neither data nor the access can be altered, and access also cannot be denied. So, if someone has accessed the data via blockchain, then there should be a kind of access log through which you can prove that this particular people has accessed the data for some purpose. Now, apart from this management of the public data, there are other case studies for the government, like processing the tax payment. So, this goods and service tax like the GST, it is an indirect tax covering various goods and services during the production and the service stages. As you all know that the use of GST for our common procurement or the purchase. So, whenever you are going to purchase something, you have to give the GST. And in our country, there are 3 different type of GST like IGST, SGST and CGST. So, the IGST is typically the interstate GST whenever the goods is transferred from one state to another. SGST is the state part of the GST, and CGST is the central part of the GST that goes to the central government. Now, the entire workflow of the GST is pretty complex. Well, so let us see that how blockchain can help in that aspect. So, here is an example. Say you want to purchase a dress, right. Now, whenever you are going to purchase a dress, it has multiple workflows at its production stages. That means the corpus is being produced. From the corpus, there are the raw materials which are being taken up not only from the corpus, from other source. Then those individual components are integrated to finally prepare the dress, and then it goes to the end user. Now, at different level, what typically happens that, say for example, the people who build up the dress, they buy the raw materials and sew the dress, and then it goes to the market. But whenever they are buying the raw material, they are paying the GST for buying that raw material. Again, whenever they are preparing the dress and selling it to someone else, that person is also providing the GST. So, that way the GST is actually levied in different stages of the production. Well, now if you just think about that how GST is handled without blockchain. So, typically a GST invoice is issued by the seller, and the buyer pays the bill with GST, and the seller registers that information to the GST portal. And finally, the seller they pays it to the supplier who has supplied the raw material. Then they also pay the GST and put it up in their portal, register that information, and that way final tax goes to the government. But in this entire procedure, there are lots of complications, like there are certain organizations who have who do not need to pay the GST. Well, they are exempted from paying GST. Sometimes the things gets duplicated, like you are procuring items and then further selling it. Now, whenever you are procuring an item and further selling it, that GST is levied twice. So that way this kind of complication comes, and in those kind of complication you can redeem the GST, and there is a option of filing GST return through which you can get back the extra money that you have given. Now, if I just think of the GST with blockchain, so what we can do that this entire settlement part of this taxation and then return, this part can be implemented with the help of smart contract that automatically calculates that how much GST need to be paid, and whether that much of GST has been paid at every level of the production stage or not. Well, and it can automatically find out that whether the GST liability meets the amount of GST that have been paid. So that way it can possibly simplify the entire end-to-end process. As I mentioned earlier, that during the payment for good or a service, these blockchain smart contracts can calculate the invoice based on the tax amount that is already levied during the production process, and this smart contract directly transfer the tax amount to tax authority like CGST or SGST, and if there is a refund, then it is directly paid to the customer's account. So that way, rather than having a kind of manual auditing process, you can have a smart contract which can possibly automate the entire process. So that way you can think of visualizing it. Well, so that way the advantages of using blockchain that we typically have is like the administrative burden for accounting services drastically reduced, and all the transactions are done in real time. No return filing is required as such, because the smart contract, they can immediately find out whether there is a requirement of providing the tax or not, and that way it can possibly avoid this kind of return filing, and all the transactions remain transparent. That way it reduces the risk of fraud or mistakes, and immediate auditing can be done from the transaction log. So that way it can actually significantly help the entire process. But as I mentioned that although we can understand the advantage of using blockchain, but for its real implementation we need to carefully think of that how the system would be implemented, that who is going to be the participant in the system, who is going to maintain the copy of the ledger, and so on. Well, so in a GST based system, again the same question comes, is it like that all buyers and seller need to maintain a copy of the ledger? And immediately the question comes that if I am going to maintain a copy of the ledger, it is not only about the transactions that I am performing, but rather it is the transactions of all the people across the country they are performing who are the part of the system. So whether I have enough resource to keep that much of data, and what is going to be the size of that ledger. So these are the kind of critical questions which we need to think of as an computer scientist, or as an engineer, as a designer of a blockchain based application. Now coming to this point of different initiatives that have been taken up by the government. So I think we mentioned it earlier as well in another lecture that this Ministry of Electronics and Information Technology in January 2021, they have published this draft national strategy on blockchain, which actually highlights the vision of the Indian government towards utilizing blockchain for different services in India. And that draft national strategy of blockchain in India, it actually enumerates a number of use cases, or highlights a number of use cases which are of potential national interest. That includes the transfer of land records, the digital certificate management, pharmaceutical supply chain, e-notary service, farm insurance, identity management, power distribution, duty payments, agriculture and other supply chains, e-voting, electronic health record management, digital evidence management system, public service delivery, IoT device management and security, vehicle life cycle management, chit fund operation administration, microfinance for self-help groups, and that way it highlights these are the kind of potential applications that people can think of building up a blockchain based solution on top of it. But as I mentioned that logically we can visualize that, well, we can possibly use blockchain to solve different kind of problems, fraudulent behaviors, scams associated with such kind of system, and we can bring transparency in the system. But at the same time we need to carefully think of how much blockchain can help because ultimately you need to implement it, and from the implementation perspective you need to carefully think of that who is going to be the node of these individual services, and whether it would be fine for them to keep an entire copy of the distributed ledger with them. Well, so that is a kind of primary questions that we should always ask for whenever we are thinking of applying blockchain for any kind of service. Then these things we have mentioned earlier, just a recap, like this draft national strategy of blockchain in India, that also highlights the development of a national blockchain infrastructure which should have the support of different blockchains on different type of platforms, including Hyperledger, Ethereum, Corda and so on. And on top of that, different applications like finance, governance, health, smart city, insurance, all these things can build up. And this blockchain based system can integrate it with the standard identity management like the Aadhaar, ePraman, that kind of website, or DigiLocker to automatically fetch the information and show it to you, to do the verification automated through the help of a smart contract. Now similarly, in National Blockchain Roadmap Australia, that is another document that have been published by the Australian government, that actually highlights the different use cases that the Australian government is thinking of having potential interest for implementing on top of blockchain. And interestingly, it actually highlights the different industries and their share of blockchain activities. So obviously, you can see that financial and insurance services have the maximum interest in blockchain activities, but apart from that, professional, scientific and technical services, retail trade, healthcare, rental, hiring and real estate services, information media, telecommunication, arts and recreational services, electricity, gas, water and waste services, all of them has a good amount of interest in different blockchain activities. Now, in conclusion, what we see that there are various scopes for applying blockchain. We can understand that well, not relying on a single point of trust or bringing transparency in the system can help us. While we agree to that, but an important question that always remains that how you are going to implement the system, because at the end it is a distributed ledger technology. So, you need to carefully think of that who are the participants in the system and how you are going to store the data in DLT, so that it becomes much more easy for the end participants to maintain a copy of the DLT with them, and that does not put up additional burden on the system. It should not require that my mobile or my computer should have 1 terabyte of storage to store a DLT. Well, and that is possibly the major bottleneck that we have today for implementing the blockchain based services or blockchain based application. Well, so we should be very careful about such kind of possible side channels which can happen, which can actually launch attack on blockchain based systems. So accordingly, we should plan designing the service. Well, so that's all from my side for this lecture. Thank you all for attending the lecture. See you all in the next.